Thank you. Is this working good? Yeah? All right. All right, here we go. I want to talk about freedom today. And this isn't normal, I think, for a lecture on the medieval contribution to the American experience. Normally, freedom is something that guys like John Locke throw in quite a bit later along the line. This is so, I think, because we are normally thinking about freedom in a very limited sense. Normally, we are thinking about limits to extrinsic power. We are talking about negative freedom, freedom from coercion. So we normally think of it in terms of tables of rights that are posited over and against the state, of constitutional arrangements, of checks and balances, and so we tend to talk about the early modern period. There doesn't seem to be much use for the Middle Ages here. In fact, I'm not sure there is much use for the Middle Ages in the whole roots of American order thing, as it is often told. Even so, it does seem that we are determined to make the Middle Ages fit in someplace. It wouldn't seem like a very good story, after all, to have a beginning in the Greeks, let's say, and have an end in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, and yet have no middle, to just sort of skip the 1,000 years from 500 to 1500. Not much of a tradition if we do that. More like play acting at a tradition. More like a bunch of modern guys doing modern stuff, or at least Renaissance stuff, who like to read the classics, who used classical language and classical aesthetics in a modern project. The problem with this sort of thing, of course, is that is not how a tradition works. Traditions are actually historically real. They are not merely a later period's appropriation of stuff that is laying around from an earlier period. So let's say, for example, that our elites in the next phase of our history got really interested in ancient Egypt. Let's say they started dressing up in that interesting headgear that we see in the paintings and started talking about Ra and building pyramids and stuff. None of that would make ancient Egypt part of their tradition. It might look that way to a historian 500 years later, but it would be an illusion. That is not how real traditions work. Rather, they are a development, like a boy becoming a man, where everything that a boy was is somehow brought up into the man, even though the man is very, very different from the boy. And he is different because things happen to him, and he does things over the course of his life that are novel, new, that were not somehow present in the boy, but nevertheless possible to the boy. He is not a deduction from premises that were already contained in the boy. He has experiences that change him in a real, unpredictable way, and yet there is no doubt in the end that the boy was him and that he is the boy. And that is because of the continuity between the two. So we are presented with a problem. If we want to claim the classics as a part of our tradition and not just material from the past that we like or that we learn from, we have to show continuity. We can't skip over those Middle Ages, as the humanists labeled them, with little methodological dodges about the monks copying texts and some sort of cultural holding pattern, waiting for the humanists to come along and restart the genius. Or maybe we have some things to say with regards to rule of law, and so we talk about Magna Carta. Now, these things are true so far as they go, and no doubt useful, but it still feels like we are searching for something, and then are very pleased with ourselves that we have found this little tidbit here or there. Oh, there is something that we can use. There is a problem here, though, especially with the whole rule of law thing, with that line of thought. The rule of law, as understood by most modern liberals, and the rule of law of the Middle Ages are almost exact opposites. To the moderns, the rule of law is based on a universal abstract code that encases the whole of society like a box, so that every man in every one of his social interactions has immediate recourse to its disinterested arbitration. The medievals had absolutely nothing that even vaguely approached this, in practice or in theory. The universal thing for them was not a code, it was justice itself. And this justice was instantiated in the very lives of peoples in what we call custom. Such custom only became law when it was under dispute, so here or there, not everywhere. We can talk then about customary law only in an analogous way. Most of the time, custom was just lived as if natural. It was only when custom failed to govern a people from inside themselves that its content could start to be articulated in propositions or quasi-statutes or rights. They were not ruled then by, as the saying goes, laws and not men. This isn't true. They were ruled by truth, by morals, by right and wrong, and this rule was always mediated through the prudence and honesty, the virtues of men. So I think the rule of law talk sometimes has a bit of bait and switch going on, playing on the word law as if positive constitutional law and customary law are two manifestations of the same sort of thing. They are not. This doesn't mean that Kirk is wrong, because he's not really saying that they are the same. Rather, I think his main point is exactly the idea that society is governed by something other than the arbitrary will of men, that there is an order that lays beneath the human constructions, a substrate or foundation on which they are built. Here, I think, we get to the tradition. And you will see how this is important for my argument in a minute. But what I really want to argue today is that our notion of freedom is medieval. But I'm not talking about negative freedom, freedom from coercion, though that is part of it. I want to talk about positive freedom. In other words, power. The ability to do something, the ability to change things, the ability to create, the ability ultimately to self-transcend, to not be bound within fixed limitations. When we think about freedom, this is what is important. The constitutional stuff is merely a means. The end is the fulfillment of the hard-to-describe intuition that a man is in his nature free, is in his nature powerful in the world, and not merely the object of power. This is the intuition and the experience that the world is open to us and not closed on top of us. This is medieval, which is not merely the combination of Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, and London. It is also the Germanic, the Goths, the Saxons, the Northmen, the Franks. In a word, the barbarian. Those people who, and please understand me with all racial connotations set aside, those people whom Nietzsche referred to as the blonde beasts. The barbarian was restless, mobile, brave, warlike, and out of its integration into the cosmos of Roman Christianity emerged what the great theologian Romano Guardini referred to as the, quote, immense medieval drive which aimed at cracking the boundaries of the world. This is power, which is freedom. But let's get down to some details. For my purposes here, freedom is the ability to do something. Such an ability implicates both the actor and the world. In order to answer the question, what can you do in the world, you must obviously answer, who are you and what is the world? If I say I am free to walk across this room, I am saying not only that I have the ability to do so in the sense that my legs work, but also that the room can be walked across, that the floor, for example, is strong enough to hold me. What is more, I must see the room as the type of place that can be walked across. If I don't experience the world, perceive it as a place capable of handling such a stroll, I am not free to walk across it. It is not in my power. And of course, if there is some barrier, a wall or a man with a gun stopping me, I likewise am not free to walk across it. But this extrinsic barrier only emerges as a barrier to my freedom if the other conditions are already satisfied. My point is that real freedom is always a combination of who I am and what the world is, both what it is concretely, extrinsically, and what it is phenomenally in relation to who I am and so my experience. So let's talk about the world first. To be free, we need to find ourselves in a place that, for the sake of this discussion, has two characteristics. It needs to be open to my movements, and it needs to have limited extrinsic power that bends me to its will, a government or a state, we might call it. Holding these two together is not easy. You can have a limited state and a closed world. Take, for example, most pre-modern pagan societies, in which every instance of power in the world is understood as a god, beyond human control or prediction. So a world governed by fate, and so characterized by anxiety and fear. Such closed worlds are often accompanied by the total oppressive social reality of what Costin Alamariu, otherwise known as Bronze Age pervert, refers to as a democratic totalitarianism, by which he means the total closed dominance of custom, of normative courses of life, the total subsuming of the horizon of possibility into a set program of life, which is the total replacing of nature with convention, and so the shutting down of human nature's potential. This forms a phenomenal world in which there isn't much need for a constructed state that stands outside it, because the world itself, from the gods that control the weather to the customs that control social life, is one giant work of human hands. Nature, in both its spiritual and physical dimensions, is itself subsumed by the artifice of convention. The total world is built by men, and yet the total world is closed to human action. Human power is near perfectly alienated, separated from man and then turned against him, holding him in bondage and taking on the form of fate or fortune, of cyclical despair. Life happens to you, you do not live it, and yet such a world is not dominated by an extrinsic state. In fact, most such societies don't really have much of a state at all. No, the bondage here is phenomenological. The world of men, is not open upwards, but closed downwards. And fear is the dominant motivating force. Only the radically different, only the hero, who can somehow beat fortune and join the ranks of the gods, has any freedom. So that is a closed world combined with a limited state, in which there is little freedom. You can also, though, have an open world and an expansive state. In fact, the more the phenomenal world is stripped of the types of pre-critical, pre-rational bonds that I just mentioned, the more it is open to a total state. As Hannah Arendt argued so well, the most extreme totalitarian regimes were, quote, mass organizations of atomized, isolated individuals, end quote. The total loyalty demanded by these regimes, she continues, can be expected only from the completely isolated human being, who, without any other social ties to family, friends, comrades, or even mere acquaintances, derives his sense of having a place in the world only from his belonging to a movement, his membership in the party, end quote. Only by destroying social hierarchies, social conventions and bonds, as well as all divinity, all notions of a natural or supernatural substrate on which order is built, can all power, including power over truth itself, be collected to the center. Obviously, we see this dynamic in progressivism or wokeism or whatever we want to call it. A world devoid of all form, all shape, is totally open to human construction, totally available to be shaped by extrinsic power. It is also a world of near perfect fear, terror, really, because the world is experienced as devoid of all coherence, as a sort of free fall, with the ground always racing up but never quite making contact. The inhabitants of such a perfectly open world, a world without form or order, as Deneen discussed, are terrified and demand that extrinsic power put it in order, build a floor on which they can stand, and they get it in the total state. Here, then, we have an open world and an expansive state, and very little freedom, and like in the first form, crushing fear. These are two different forms of tyranny. In both cases, the person as a free actor, as a creative being who lives in a world open to his creativity, is destroyed, is buried beneath the seamless work of human hands, beneath what Thomas Hobbes referred to as a common power to keep them in awe, the Leviathan. It does not matter which form of tyranny we are talking about, the person is a slave, and he learns to be servile, to be weak, and becomes filled with bitterness, envy, ressentiment, as Nietzsche would put it, and so unhappy. In order to be free, it would seem, that we need to have both an open world and a limited state. And yet these characteristics are obviously in great tension. In fact, from within classical political theory, it is not clear that such a combination is even possible. The open and voluntary regime of freedom is almost always a sort of fairy tale, a sort of thought experiment. But as if things weren't looking bad enough for freedom, we need to add the subjective factor. Even if we could somehow combine an open world with a limited state, freedom requires also a certain type of subject, a subject that experiences his open world exactly as a world in which he can and ought to act, can and ought to move, can and ought to create, to fashion a place for himself to live. He has to be free, not only exteriorly, but interiorly. Otherwise, he is a slave, regardless of what kind of world and what kind of state he has. The classical tradition explains over and over again that tyranny is rule through fear. This is because obviously, why else would people obey a power that doesn't have their best interests at heart? Tyrants rule through fear, rendering the people subject to them slaves. But it works in reverse as well. Fear renders the world subjectively tyrannical. What I mean is that fearful, anxious people experience the world as hostile, as arrayed against their interests, and so experience the world exactly as does a slave, even if they live in a space that is objectively open to their freedom. Similarly, the classics never tire of telling us that free societies are virtuous societies, that just rule creates virtuous subjects. But again, the reverse is also the case, subjectively. A vice-ridden man experiences the world as closed, even if it isn't. We can imagine, for example, a person who lives in an open world with a limited state, who is, let's say, addicted to heroin. Even though the world is open to him, he experiences it as closed. He experiences everything he encounters merely as it relates to his next hit of drugs, and so his rationality becomes small. His phenomenal world is small and cramped and governed by hostile powers, and it makes no sense to describe him as free. So in the end, freedom, in the way I want to talk about it today, has three components: an open world, a limited state or other extrinsic power, and a free soul. Here I want to shift here and talk about the High Medieval period, roughly 1100 to 1350 is what I'll be talking about. As we have seen, phenomenal cosmology and anthropology are bound up together, the world and the man. So here's a little sketch, very simple, of the medieval world. It seems simple, actually, though it's rather complex, and I'll try to explain. So we have the physical temporal world, from Earth through the stars. Then outside the world, we have God. But outside is just an analogy. What we really mean is that God transcends the world, is entirely other. This is the crucial move for understanding medieval cosmology. God is not the most good or the most powerful or the most true or any other most. He transcends all these notions by completing them entirely beyond any meaning that we can ascribe to them. This is hard to understand, but it makes all the difference in the world, so to speak, because it allows for him to be a true creator, not just at the top or in the beginning or some other finite, quantifiable manner, but to be the creator absolutely, always, everywhere. Let me try to explain that. So first, let's talk about things. Everything that God makes is made in the image of God, or if that is too strong, it bears a trace of God. The way the medievals like to express this is with the concept of divine ideas, and they often use the example of a human potter making a pot. When a potter sets about making a pot, he has an idea in his head, an exemplar, of the pot he wants to make, and then he sets about shaping the clay accordingly. This means that the finished product is made in the image of the potter's idea, and therefore in the image of him once removed. He is somehow in the pot. There is an ontological connection between them. So the medievals understood all of physical reality in this way. Everything that was made according to a divine exemplar, according to divine ideas. So they were not God. The pot is not the potter. In fact, the distance between the pot and the potter is qualitative and not quantitative, and therefore, in a sense, infinite. Similarly, the difference between creatures and the divine was not a matter of quantity, but even still, they were not wholly divorced from God either. Rather, each thing somehow bore the image of the divine, though in a different mode. The tree imaged God in a tree-ish way, the rock in a rockish way, the dog in a doggish way, and so on. The whole cosmos together then showed God in an ever more perfect way as more and more angles of vision opened up. But it didn't matter how much more perfect the overall image became. The distance between it and God himself was never actually closed because he is truly transcendent. This was the basis for the doctrine of the analogia entis, the analogy of being, which the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 expressed this way, quote, "No similarity, however great, can be noted between creature and creator without an ever greater dissimilarity being noted," end quote. So God is both ever closer and ever further away. Essential to an ever more perfect notion of God is that God is ever more different than that notion. This translated directly to our knowledge of the world. It doesn't matter how much I know about dogs, for example, the content of God's divine idea of dog is ever greater. Mine is finite, his is infinite. As my knowledge becomes more true, more complete, it becomes more incomplete, more aware of its own lack of completeness. St. Thomas Aquinas asserted that one could never come to finally know the nature of even a gnat. But I've gotten a little ahead of myself here, because human beings are only capable of knowing anything about the nature of things, because we participate in a special way in the rationality of God. We somehow perceive the divine ideas, the natures, the universals that lie within the particulars. We see the potter in the pot, something that an animal does not do. But on the other hand, this perception is not direct vision like the angels, or even less so, the identity of subject and object as in the mind of God. It is rather participation, which is a very difficult, very complicated notion that we don't have time to go into. But the point for our purposes here is that this participation is what allows the human being to construct the similarity side of the analogy of being, the side that is always offset by the ever greater difference. Our knowledge is a finite participation in the infinite, and so it is itself an image of the divine. What I'm trying to argue is that we do build our world. It is a human construction. And yet this construction is not divorced from transcendent truth, but is rather, to the extent that it is just, an expression of that truth, an expression that is always, always offset by the openness that lies between it and the infinite truth of the divine, the ever greater difference, both in the direction of the eternal up and in the direction of the finite down. This is the heart of the notion of human law as understood in the High Middle Ages. The human law is a specification of the natural law, a specification which is only possible because the human natural law is a rational participation in the eternal law. It's a lot of big words and concepts, which is just a way of saying that we shape the finite through our participation in the infinite. And so the fruit of that construction, our world, contains within it the potentiality of its own surpassing. It is open, and yet it has form, structure, real existence. In the ideal, the world of human construction is both relative and yet capable of truth, relative yet not relativistic. It is a work of human hands and yet is not an idol, does not assert the completeness that the pagan world asserted or democratic totalitarianisms assert. And yet it has real authority because it is true, a true and yet finite, limited, particular participation in the always greater difference of truth itself. Within this world, then, the movement deeper into the knowledge of self is the movement deeper into the knowledge of nature and deeper into the knowledge of God. The tradition calls this movement virtue, of course. Because the self and the world are different modes of participation in the same transcendent source, the cultivation of the perfection of the self is always at the same time an opening up of the world. To move closer to the self is always to move closer to nature because it is always moving closer to God, who is the prime analogate of the whole thing, the self and the world. Virtue is the construction of the self in the process of the construction of a phenomenal world that is open upwards into the infinite and so is always prepared to be pushed further beyond and deeper in. The world of human construction can claim no completeness. Neither nature nor God is contained within it. It is undermined in both directions. We don't really know God or the gnat, and yet this world, again in the ideal, is true, is a correspondence, analogical and not univocal between the idea and the thing. It is a real world that holds together and yet is not closed down, either from above or from below. Movement closer to God is movement closer to oneself, which is a movement deeper into nature. The objective and the subjective move together. The world is revealed as more open to the man, which always includes a revealing of the inadequacy of the human construction, which is the movement. The construction is the movement. Always then, this movement includes a rooting up and a planting, as the book of Jeremiah describes it, or perhaps a breaking of tablets and a creating of new ones, as Zarathustra would have it. Here is what I am getting at by freedom. Freedom is a movement into increase, into the ever greater difference, a movement without a backstop. The experience of freedom is dynamic. It is not a stable condition, but a form of action, of life. I might even suggest the word vitalism to describe it if that word were available to me, but it's not. But, and this is very important, this freedom exceeds human ability. What I mean is this: no effect can exceed its cause. This is a basic metaphysical principle that seems rather sound. How could we ourselves produce the resources to become greater than ourselves? What this means is that movement deeper into the truth is a movement that requires reception, passivity. We must be worked on from above. Grace and revelation are not then added into this social imaginary, as Charles Taylor would call it, but are essential to its very form. Man responds to a call to step out into the wilderness, into that which lays beyond the work of human hands, the realm we control. And this call, this vocation to which we are able to respond, is a necessary aspect of what it means to be free. Without it, we become slaves to our own limited powers, like an animal. This freedom moves in two directions. It moves to expand the human world upwards, we might say, and it moves to purify the human world from disorder, from sin, downwards or inwards, we might say. Both movements increase the actual real power of man, which is the ever deeper correspondence between man, the world, and God. The increase in power, this is what Nietzsche is getting at when he talks about the will to power, and I think that in a roundabout way, he is right, though I won't hesitate, as he does, to call the experience of such increasing power happiness. So again, when talking about Christianity, I ironically find myself talking about Nietzsche, which I think brings me back to the barbarians. In this anthropological cosmology, as we have seen, there are two movements: the movement of receptivity and the movement of activity, the passive and the active. One must receive from God revelation and grace in order to act with power, to move deeper in and further out. The transformation of the self makes possible the transformation of the world. And I want to make some correlations here to the Middle Ages that are not perfect, but that are informative, I think. So I think we can correspond the receptive movement to the ancient church, the persecuted church, which becomes the monastic church, characterized by martyrdom, by the saints who suffered the world as they achieved inner perfection. The active movement, I want to correspond to the barbarian, the warrior, the conqueror, the one who can break through man-made conventions, the builder of worlds. The High Middle Ages emerged as a combination of these two, a combination that was expressed in the language of the contemplative and active lives, the language of the spiritual and temporal power, the language of the inner and outer man, the interior and exterior forums, the language of grace and law, the language of the clergy and the laity, even the language of the Old and the New Testaments. Martyrdom, the receptive, the humble, the inner, is combined directly with the active, the coercive, the combative. Both movements adopt the other in their own mode. The monks were the knights of Christ who waged spiritual war. The chivalric knight sacrificed himself for the good, and the crusader became a literal martyr, earning his crown and so his eternal reward. The monks were the milites Christi, the knights of Christ, sometimes literally wearing armor as a form of penance in the cloister, but everywhere engaged in spiritual warfare. The knights became a sort of religious order. Conversely, the knights became a sort of religious order through chivalry and then literally in the Templars and the other military orders. As James of Vitry described them, quote, going in time of war, returning in time of peace, going by means of action, returning by means of contemplation, going in war to fight, returning in peace to repose and devotion to prayer, so that they are like soldiers in battle and like monks in convent, end quote. St. Bernard of Clairvaux wrote, quote, truly a fearless knight and secure on every side is he whose soul is protected by the armor of faith, just as his body is protected by the armor of steel. Doubly armed, surely he need fear neither demons nor men, end quote. The medieval church then consisted essentially of both movements, or contained essentially both movements. As the standard opening line of multiple treatises reads, quote, in the church there are two powers, the spiritual and the temporal, end quote. But they were not talking merely about popes and kings or bishops and knights. The two powers were the two powers of Christianity itself, and not a description of the contingent constitutional arrangements of so-called church and state. The spiritual power was grace itself, and it was most intense not on the papal throne, but at the humble faithful's reception of the Eucharist confected by some peasant priest at one of the tens of thousands of altars throughout Christendom. The temporal power was most intense not as vested in some divine right monarch or emperor, but in the authority of the humble father and his directly social political vocation, which he gained through his baptism, confirmation, and marriage, making making possible prudence. The two powers, the contemplative and the active, the receptive and the adventurous, were the powers that coursed through the whole and provided the substrate on which the particular institutional arrangements were planted and rooted up and planted again. It was theological indeed, but no less political. The great canonist Hostenstus argued that, quote, the laity are similar to the Father through their power, and theirs is the civil law. The religious are similar to the Holy Spirit through their holiness, and their law is theology. And the secular clerics are similar to the Son through wisdom, and they are the masters of canon law. As the three types of men are a trinity that form a unity in the Holy Church and the Catholic faith, so the three persons of the Trinity find unity in their essence and divinity, end quote. This is the beginning of a treatise on canon law, okay? To be free is to be a warrior on both the spiritual and the temporal fronts, but also always to be humble on both fronts, to be active and passive, contemplative and practical. Both of these moves require a profound courage, a courage that is rooted ultimately in hope, the abiding confidence that through faith, charity is possible. This is the antithesis of fatalism and so fear. Fear creates slaves, courage, freedom. As St. Thomas Aquinas explained, quote, for tyrants hold the good in greater suspicion than the wicked, and to them the valor of others is always fraught with danger. So tyrants strive to prevent those of their subjects who have become virtuous from acquiring valor and high spirits, in order that they may not want to cast off their iniquitous domination, end quote. As I explained, this free world is one of perpetual movement, what the medievals called reform, which wasn't just the elimination of corruption, but a wholesale push ever deeper into perfection. Reform was not only remedial, a reforming man was a free man. Freedom is to reform oneself. Freedom is the formation of ourselves, a formation that has no end, properly so called, because the end is deification, a movement into the ever greater difference of the analogia entis. This is what Gordini was talking about when he spoke of the immense medieval drive which aimed at cracking the boundaries of the world. This is all pretty abstract. Now, what about the concrete, actual life? Did we have an open world and a limited government? For the medievals, as we have seen, the world was not a world of chaos, a formless space that had to be subdued by violence. Rather, it was rational and held together, but it wasn't ready-made. Rather, the human world had to be constructed on this substrate of reasonableness. The result of this construction was what they called the peace, to the extent that it was a movement into truth and so happiness, so to the extent that it was just. Through the dynamic I've discussed, this peace was really approachable. Human beings really could build social relationships that moved toward charity and respect and not toward domination and violence. The form of this peace was the product of human creativity, a relative specification of the absolute for a particular group of people, and so it varied from place to place. This posed no problem for the medievals. They understood that the way of life of a people, the way that they lived together at peace, their custom, was the most perfect form of human law, the most perfect way in which man's freedom was manifested through his participation in the eternal law as a specification of the natural law. Custom was the social form of virtue. Custom ultimately ruled. As St. Thomas asserts, quote, custom has the force of law, abolishes law, and is the interpreter of law, end quote. But does this bring us back then to democratic totalitarianism, the tyranny of convention? No, because there was no sense that any customary regime was the very structure of nature itself. No sense that it was somehow the will of the gods or the code handed down by the divine ancestors or the result of the racial blood coursing through their veins. It was always provisional, always understood as able to be dispensed, always understood to be the way that we live, this group lives, but not the way life itself was. It was changed all the time, and that was fine. That was expected, as long as it changed peacefully, as long as it was a product of reformation. And what was more, it was capable of being judged. First, from within. The individual within his world is not merely a social unit, but a person, a rational being who develops himself through his increasing communion with the divine, and so his increasingly coherent world. The world of human construction in which he lives is not accidental to this dynamic, but it does not exhaust it. The virtuous man becomes increasingly capable of judging from within himself whether convention is true exactly as he becomes more completely formed in that convention and knows it ever deeper from the inside, even as he knows increasingly the nooks and crannies of his own soul. This is the virtue of prudence, the virtue of the lawgiver, the maker of custom. Custom is the law, and its authority is real, but it is always open to being corrected and always open to being transcended, being modified, being perfected through the agency of real acting persons who in their virtue reach beyond convention. That this really existed is manifested in the seemingly strange reality that Latin Christendom was not ordered into clans and tribes, governed through longhouses, as the Neo-Nietzscheans might put it. One's world was not a world of merely human construction, rooted in myths of blood and soil that rendered one's place within the order fixed. The villages of Christendom were not closed societies of totalitarian customary convention. They were bound together into larger groups that both respected the integrity of the smaller and rendered it relative. What I'm saying is that both spiritual and temporal powers were both communitarian and cosmopolitan. Consider, for the spiritual power, the constant movement of monks between monasteries. Think of the great orders of the Dominicans and the Franciscans, who moved freely through Europe. And of course, the universities, where scholars from all over Christendom came from their little communitarian homes in order to engage in a truly cosmopolitan project. The temporal power structured those little homes that they came from, of course. It ruled through the customs of the local villages and through networks of friends, which we call the feudal system. And yet, at the same time, the great crusading armies were called together, maybe 100,000 men from all over Christendom, to engage in truly cosmopolitan campaigns. The little participated in the large, and the large subsisted in the little. The morals of the smaller, of the communitarian, were particular specifications of a larger order, an order that found ultimate unity in the universal teachings of the spiritual power, teachings that had to be made real in the particular customary ways of life of the smaller communities. So, for example, even though the different groupings of nobility throughout Christendom had very different customs concerning authority and obedience, concerning lordship and vassalage, concerning the juridical structure of military and political organization, different instantiations of the virtue of their class, even so, honor, honesty, prowess, generosity, courtesy, courage, the virtues of the class reached beyond all these particularities, and the nobles were capable of cooperating and conversely of judging each other according to right and not merely according to relative power. Their small spaces were real social spaces with real power within which people really lived, and yet they were bound together under higher spaces that did not destroy those smaller spaces, but provided them a ground on which to subsist. Here then we can turn to the limited government aspect of freedom. What role did coercive power have? What barriers did it place before men? As we have seen in this world, society was ordered through particular instantiations of justice rather than abstract justice, among persons rather than legal entities. This order was based on the real relation, for example, between a husband and his wife, between a lord and his vassal, between a priest and his parishioner, and not, as in the liberal order, on their reduction to some rump of quantitative sameness, not on their integration into some universal law code or system of rights. Conflict, of course, ripped this social fabric here or there, but not everywhere. The sword was accordingly deployed justly only in response to real conflict. Those who wielded the sword did so, therefore, not within a universal structure that included all people and all things. No such structure existed. No state existed. Rather, higher temporal powers approached and engaged with smaller societies that were constituted by actual prior relationships, made possible by the spiritual and temporal powers that operated at those smaller levels. The parish priests and the humble fathers that I mentioned earlier. These relationships bound the scope of action of those higher powers. Coercion's field of action was necessarily limited to the actual conflict at hand. It had no standing prior claim to action across the whole social field. In fact, because the peace, the customary law between persons, was real, higher temporal powers literally couldn't know what the peace was, what the law was, we might say, until it was called in to defend it. Take, for example, a case from King St. Louis IX's Parliament, his court, High Court. The peasants of a certain village went every spring to a nearby wood to cut down dead trees for firewood. One year, the local nobles stopped them on the way home and forcibly took their laden carts. They protested, saying, "We have always taken firewood from this forest." "Indeed," responded the knight, "but you have always taken only one cartload. This year you have two." Parliament held an inquest and ruled that in the previous 40 years, sometimes the peasants had loaded one cart, sometimes two. The knight was wrong and had violated the peace through his actions, and he was ordered to pay amends. A conflict had shattered the peace, and the conflict was not resolved by appeal to abstract rights or laws, but to the particulars of time and place before the conflict had erupted, to the real relationships between real persons, which is to say, to the lived reality of the peace. In order for the temporal power to act, the king had to first determine what the peace in the situation had actually been. He had to enter into a particular world over which he did not rule and previously could not even see, and act as a judge. In the 16th century, Bodin argued that the ability to make law was the defining feature of the sovereign, a power that he vested in the king. Louis XIV, of course, declared that his will simply was the law. The modern sovereign was the source of social order. No such sovereignty existed in the Middle Ages. Or if we must find it someplace, we must locate it in the never-ceasing negotiations made by real people within the peace, the negotiations which created the form of the peace through both spiritual and temporal power. If higher temporal powers attempted to extend themselves into these spaces, which of course they did, they were unjust, and the people were capable of judging them as such because their little worlds reached beyond their form toward the universal, and so were open to prudential judgment. Here then is the limited state, not in theory but in practice. There was no bureaucracy, there was no administration, there was no standing army, there was no centralized law code, and yet there was not chaos. There was not a war of all against all, and there was not the sort of social discontent that could lead to revolts and revolutions, which hardly ever happened. And my argument here is that this is so because most of the people, most of the time, were free men. This created a civilization of both profound originality and profound stability. The world was both open and confident, brave. Is there anything braver than their construction of the Gothic cathedrals, or the sheer bravado of the great summa of the theologians? This was the period of pioneers who colonized Europe and brought it under cultivation. We think of Europe as always settled, as always devoid of wilderness, but this obviously was not the case. And it was the men of the High Middle Ages who settled it, who cleared the forests, drained the swamps, who moved deeper into the wilderness, both internal to their own kingdoms and on the peripheries, into Eastern Europe and Northern Europe, bringing Christendom with them. It was a period of immense population growth, tripling in a couple hundred years. All these things happened, and yet was there any progress in the modern sense? Well, no. What there was perpetual reform, movement deeper in and further out. It was a civilization that combined ambition with humility, idealism with realism. It was, in the end, a hopeful society, which is a brave society. Of course, what does all this have to do with America's freedom? Isn't America as liberal, as modern as they come? In some respects, of course, but in many other respects, not so much. America's history is not a programmatic progression of liberalism from Enlightenment philosophical error in the beginning to inevitable corruption and collapse at the end. Our history is way more complex than that. The American spirit, the American way of life, our culture is not merely hedonistic individualism overlaid by shallow Lockean platitudes. It is true that we have sometimes described ourselves in this manner, often. Our appreciation of such doctrines as the consent of the governed, popular sovereignty, natural rights, rule of law, checks and balances, self-rule, can and have been read in a thoroughly liberal manner. But such a reading does not exhaust what these formulations attempted to capture at a deeper cultural level, which is a way of being in the world that did not suppose the world to be the mere domain of powerful men or scary forces, but knew it as an open, unbounded place of real human freedom, a freedom that has its foundation on the truth that each of us is under God, and that because of this, we have the resources to be free. Indeed, if the ideology of liberalism seems to be more advanced in America, it is because it feeds directly on this powerful truth, hoodwinking us with false promises of freedom, promises that we are duped into believing because we are a people who love being free. Part of what has offended me in the approach of many pro-state post-liberals is their lack of concern with, or even sometimes a disdain for, this deep cultural love. This is a posture I fear that they share with the corrupt oligarchs who are currently attempting to pillage and ultimately destroy America, and I think it's mistaken. This does not mean that a naive or jingoistic defense of all things American is the order of the day. Such a move would be ironically rather un-American. As we have seen in this conference, America is a nation of contradictions. I think it is a part of our character to be inconsistent. America is liberal, and yet we are the biggest critics of liberalism. We are secular and yet religious. We are individualistic, and yet we are lovers of family, of community, and of country, and glorify self-sacrifice in defense of things bigger than ourselves. We make one error after the next, and yet we are the ones continuously pointing them out. We are profoundly self-reflective and self-critical. Even the anti-Americanism that is popular overseas is mostly an export from America. We have been this way since the beginning. The defining event of our history, the Civil War, is a testament to this trait. Don't you think that this is so because we know convention and human construction is always at best analogs of the truth? That we at some level know that we are under a truth that we can never possess, even if we continue trying to move towards it? We are capable of bettering ourselves precisely because we are capable of criticizing ourselves, and this is because we are, I think, historically brave. We are willing to get on the ship, to take on the empire, to load up the wagon, to get on the troop transport, to do things. As I have argued here, bravery is the unspoken prerequisite of freedom. We are capable of living in an open world only because we are brave enough to go out into it, to make mistakes, to suffer the consequences, to reflect on them, to change ourselves, and to venture out into the open again, to give it another go, to make another round of mistakes. But this is possible only because we are brave enough to humble ourselves before God, to make ourselves small, to receive from above, to respond to the call out into the wilderness. We are brave enough to be reforming. The American way of living is decentralized and founded on the conviction that we can rule ourselves and that real freedom is possible. What I'm hoping to get across today, was that we do not have to give this up to be serious, hard-nosed, black-pilled, if I'm using that right, political Christians. We do not have to become European-style authoritarians to be Christian, as I am afraid some in the post-liberal or integralist camps seem to think. I will go much further. It is not only that Christianity can structure America's notion of freedom toward ultimate truth. It is that we have been the way we are because we have been one of the most Christian people in the world. I would argue that European sovereign states came into being exactly as Christianity was being steadily replaced as the substrate on which society was built. The reality of the spiritual power had already been denied. Christianity had already been subjected to a totalized temporal power, which, by virtue of that totalization, was no longer the Christian temporal power, but a false transcendence, a work of human hands claiming a sovereignty that only God can hold. This absolutism set about destroying the decentralized free way of life that the spiritual and temporal power had made possible, and replacing it with one form of tyranny or another. This absolutism was the power that the liberals reacted to, sought to appropriate, sought to concentrate in their parliaments and legislatures, to corral with the rule of law, and to define with systems of rights, to make, in my estimation at least in the end, an even more perfect tyranny possible. I think a very strong case can be made that the America of the founding, perhaps naively, sidestepped this development and lingered longer, de facto if not de jure, in the decentralized Christian structures of the pre-modern period, that it had not yet been sucked into the trap of sovereignty. I'm no American historian, but my reading of classics such as Tocqueville leads me to believe that there is something to this. As Dr. Gustafson pointed out to me yesterday, Tocqueville directly asserts that the American township shared a social form with the pre-modern European parishes, the village communities of free Europe. I think it is quite likely that our freedom, and I'm not talking about our constitutional rights, I'm talking about our subjective experience of freedom, our intuition that we are free people living in a world that is open to our freedom. I'm talking about the fact that so many Americans for so long just felt this way about themselves. I think it is quite likely that this is a long survival of a very old form, one that most of the powers of Europe forgot in their race towards 20th century destruction, but which lingered on longer in America, even if it too is now fading. The fancy Europeans, like to call us barbarians. Damn straight. And this doesn't make us any less Christian. It makes us our kind of Christian. Thank you.